For those of you who have just joined, we'll be starting promptly at 1:05. So a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the last of the Zoom webinars for the year. And we're privileged to have Edwin Selbst talking about ethics and professional skepticism and judgments. And I suppose there's right and wrong and everything in between. So Edwin, I suppose you're going to talk about all the shades of grey. And you've been with us before, and thank you for coming back again. And the floor is yours.
Right, thanks, Stan. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see me. I think, in terms of what Stan was saying, I think, when it comes to ethics, very much so, it's those decisions that we have to take, which are obvious. Those aren't the ones that we need to discuss and deliberate on. People know what's right and wrong. But the challenge is where it's, as Stan said, where it's grey, where there's a level of professional judgment, that's where we need to apply our minds. And what we're going to be looking at today is understanding, when it comes to professional skepticism, what's changed, what does the code say, what do we as chartered accountants need to do, where we are challenged in terms of our ethical principles, what is an appropriate response, what is a tool that we can do to deal with ethical challenges, and when is something ethical that there's something that we need to be concerned about. So in terms of timing, I hope everybody can hear me, and good afternoon again to everybody, those of you who've just joined. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Edwin Selbst. I'm from Sorry Consulting. I run a training and audit consulting company, specializing in the requirements of the international standards on auditing and the related topics, Companies Act and ethics. And from a perspective of today's session, this is what we've got on for the agenda. From a timing perspective, I'm going to propose after 2 o'clock, we have a 5-minute leg stretch, literally 5 minutes. And then after 3 o'clock, we probably have another 15 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Stan, Danny, would that work, or should we go for a bit longer?
Let's go.
We're in your hands.
So maybe I think it'll work. Let's go for sort of maybe a 10-minute, and then we can try for a 15-minute break after 2 hours. So let's see. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Zoom details. If you do have any questions, please post them in the question and answer. I'll be watching that. If you've got any other things, Stan and Danny, if I can just ask you to check the chat, but if we can keep the questions to the Q&A, and then we can just monitor them there, but more formally. We do have some video clips that I'm going to be showing too, if I recall. As part of today's presentation, we did do a quick sound check, so hopefully that'll work. Maybe as we start, I'll just ask for a thumbs up, just to make sure that it's audible and you can hear. So in terms of looking at accountants and looking at professional accountants, we've got the Code of Ethics. And when we look at ethics, ethics refers to a system or way in which conduct is standardized. And the reason we need to do that is because depending on your background, depending on your moral duties, but depending on how, in what sort of society, in what sort of religious background you've grown up, people, based on their moral duties and obligations, interpret ways of conduct in a different manner. And therefore, when it comes to ethics, professions standardize the way in which we need to operate so that there is a level of common playing ground and a level of understanding of what do I need to do when I'm engaging with my clients, when I'm engaging with fellow professionals, so that my own nuances, my own preferences are then neutralized, and we're all operating on a standard basis so that there's no room for misunderstandings or own sort of personal biases. And therefore, when we look at a session on ethics, we need to understand that we have the fundamental principles, we have the RBA code, we have the IFAC code, we have SAICA's Code of Ethics. And maybe if I can just ask, maybe in the chat, if I can just have a understanding just from the audience, where just over or 60 people, if you exclude myself, Stan and Danny. So if I can just ask you in the chat, if you can just tell me if you're a member of SAICA and URBA, or SAIPA, if you have any members from SAIPA, if you can just sort of type that in there and then just hit send, and then it'll just fill the screen so that I can just understand that the audience that I'm communicating with. Thank you. Okay, I'll just let that Okay, I'll just give it another couple of seconds. Okay, great. So that's quite an interesting mix of psycho, cyber, urban, and even some I haven't even heard of. Cyber I've heard of, but SPCA, I'm not sure which one that is. If you're welcome to share that one with me, if you can expand on that acronym, I'd appreciate it. But thanks very much for your for your participation. Okay, great. And then thanks. I see some of you also did that on the Q&A. That's fine. Thank you. Great. So let's then understand then that, remember, from the aspect of the code, and let's understand in terms of these different professional bodies, who actually is who and where does our code of ethics come from that we need to subscribe to. I am familiar with cyber, urban, and cyber, but if anybody's got information about any of the others, if you can maybe just give me the full name in the chat, that would help me just in terms of directing my talk today. So in terms of your ethical responsibilities, so in terms of IFAC, IFAC is the International Federation of Accountants, which is an organization based in the US, in New York. Interesting, we actually are, I know two people from South Africa that have actually left and are actually working there. And apparently there's a lot of ex-South Africans that I've met actually in 2017 in various roles that are also active at IFAC in terms of having a passion for the technical side of things. So what's actually happened is that IFAC produces guidance for professional accountants around the world. And they have two main bodies that I want to talk about. And that is the IAASB, the International Assurance Board for Auditors, and they are responsible for setting all the standards like compilation engagements and the auditing standards for those of you that are auditors. And then they have another organization called the IESBA, the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants. And what they do is they set the IFAC Code of Ethics, which then it's a requirement that any professional body who is a member of IFAC then needs to comply with. And what they do is they then mandate which standards are applicable to their members. So, for example, SICA and SIPA are member bodies of IFAC, and as a member body, they then need to make sure that their members are then complying with the different standards and guidance, technical and ethical, that IFAC put out. In terms of the SAGISA, the Chartered Governance Institute of South Africa, I would imagine the principles here, Wendy, would be similar to those of any professional, but I'm not sure if your body is a member of IFAC. I don't think so, from my knowledge. But I think the principles would be equally applicable. If there are other acronyms that I haven't mentioned, if you just let me know who they are, what they are, that would also help. Thanks very much. So when it comes then to the yeah, I haven't changed them yet. That's why they're not changing. I'm still on the first slide, so thanks for that comment. When it comes to the responsibilities of a professional accountant, so a professional accountant needs to apply the code and the different sections to the code. And what's happened is that there have been changes to the code, some of them dating as far back as 2018, when the entire code was rewritten. The SICA code, the IRBA code of professional conduct, or I think that's the terminology the RBA use, and SICA, is that those are based on the IFAC Code of Ethics. And what's happened with the collapses of Enron, our local collapses in South Africa of African Bank, the whole Oak Bay and the Gupta scandal, there's been a huge focus on ethics, and very much a requirement whereby practitioners understand their ethical responsibilities. SICA, SIPA, as well as the RBA have mandatory ethics requirements, depending on which body you belong to make sure that you then carry out your responsibilities and are aware and up to date with what's changed. So in terms of the IFAC code, which is the fundamental for ethics for accountants, there's been improvements to the structure of the code. The previous code was found to be a bit confusing as to what applied when, under which circumstances. There's also been revisions to safeguards, and safeguards particularly around independence. And it's important to realize that when those safeguards are applicable and when not. We're going to be spending a lot of time on professional skepticism and professional judgment, and understanding which sections of the code are applicable to different professional accountants. There's also changes that have been made for inducements, and then understanding how the code has been structured. And the reason I think that's important is, hopefully, if you do have a ethical question, you can then navigate yourself through the different sections of the code to know, well, what do I need to do? Is this something that I need to be concerned of based on my membership, based on the aspects of which the services that I'm offering, etc. And the RBA, as well as SICA and SIPA, have taken the recent amendments and then incorporated that into their local codes, which their members need to ascribe to. So, in terms of the revised code, the code was completely rewritten with a new structure and drafting conventions used to make it much more user-friendly, to clarify and amplify what a safeguard is and to understand when those safeguards need to be utilized, to strengthen the independence provisions, because if you're doing an audit, there's certain requirements. If you're doing an independent review, there are certain independence requirements. If you're giving other level of assurance, there's certain independence expectations that are imposed upon you. And if you're doing tax work, if you're doing compilations, if you're doing consulting, bookkeeping, accounting, well, what is the level of independence and which of the fundamental principles do we need to adhere to and comply with? And we need to understand also, as Stan was saying, if something is clear cut, well, everybody knows part of being honest means you can't steal. But part of being honest also means that there's an understanding of, well, when you interact with a client, what does integrity mean? And those are the aspects which we need to then focus on. We'll be discussing that just in terms of the fundamental principles. And wherever we apply our minds, wherever we apply our thoughts, and we arrive at an application of how we have considered the fundamental principles, looked at the safeguards, looked at if there are any inducements that could be impairing our objectivity, then we need to make sure that we document that somebody else can have a look at that at a later stage, so that there's evidence of how we've actually done it, and it gives us a chance to introspect. There's certain requirements in the code where one has to document how one's applying one's mind, and other times it's just merely encouraged. And then we're going to be focusing on professional skepticism, and professional skepticism applies in no matter what service you offer. Professional skepticism is an aspect of the code that has been enhanced since the 2018 amendments. So we've already been with those for 3 years now. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail. And it makes no difference if you're doing a compilation, if you're doing bookkeeping, if you're doing tax work. That is an area which all professional accountants need to apply their minds. Maybe just before we go on, just if I can also ask you in the chat, just to sort of put there what your sort of core services are, your main source of income. Is it audit? Is it independent reviews, consulting, bookkeeping? Just if you don't mind sharing that with us, so we can just helps me also adjust my training. So if you can just sort of put that in the chat, and then I'll have a look. Okay, I'll just give you a couple of another half a minute or so just to see if there's any more responses coming through. Thanks to those of you that have shared sort of the types of services you're offering. Just helps me know the audience a bit better, since we can't have actual discussions, and just helps me direct and just fine-tune the training. Great. Thanks very much, everybody, for your participation. So, let's then understand, when it comes to the aspect of inducements, and inducements could affect one's integrity, even unknowingly, or very much one's objectivity. And the focus of the code is that this addresses all different types of services. Some are in audit and assurance, there's a greater level. So independent reviews and audit, there's a greater level of prohibitions when it comes to inducements. But we need to make sure that we are alerted to the impact that an inducement can have. And the first thing that we need to do is just understand the definition of an inducement, and that is something which has the ability to influence behavior, but does not necessarily have the intent to influence improper behavior. And it's important that we realize that, because when the media gets hold of information, as soon as there's an inducement, it becomes a headline. We've seen that quite often with the Gupta scandals. I remember the audit partner of KPMG, for example, was invited to the Gupta wedding. Now, we're not here to debate what's right or wrong and what's accepted, but what we need to understand is that there's a level of independence that needs to be maintained, and that's mandatory under certain requirements. But when it comes to aspects such as forensics, such as taxation services, consulting, where there is a inducement that can give rise to the impairment of one's objectivity, and sometimes go beyond what would be what would be expected and what would be allowed in terms of the standards. And therefore, we need to make sure that, for example, gifts, I think that's something that was the only aspect that was specifically mentioned in the previous code. Now, what's been included is hospitality. Some people have holiday homes. Some people have like to invite people to sporting events, entertainment, client lunches, these sort of aspects, political or charitable donations, appeals to friendship and loyalty. People tell me I'm involved in sort of quality control reviews for some of my audit clients, monitoring reviews. And, often what you hear is that, we know the client very well. That's great. It leads to a better level of cooperation. You know what to expect. but there's also a level of familiarity that could lead to an impairment of one's objectivity under such circumstances. You know, it's interesting, sometimes we're involved in quality control reviews, whereby an external party comes into, from a risk perspective, to make sure that quality is at the right level, and these sort of reviews take place prior to the sign-off of an audit opinion. And, you know, we find that people mention that, you know, I've been doing this audit for 10 years, 20 years, you know, I play golf with this person, you know, our parents were friends, we've grown up together, or whatever the scenario is. And we need to just be careful of impairing the objectivity of professionals, because we have a level of comfort with somebody, and therefore, well, we may not be as alert as we should. And we'll discuss that in a bit more detail. And the same would go for employment or other commercial opportunities. You know, you're in business with somebody, or professional treatment. You know, I've been out of audit myself personally. I was a partner for 12 years at a medium-sized auditing firm some time ago. But, you know, preferential treatment, you know, you would get discounts on their stock, certain that's not available to other people in the market. And, you know, one needs to just be careful, because these sort of inducements can impair one's objectivity. Makes no difference if you're doing business rescue. You may have a creditor that is that one of the creditors that in terms of coming up with your business rescue plan, that may then you may be subtly subconsciously looking to favor without even realizing. And we need to just be alert for the impact that inducements can have. When it comes to the types of inducements, the code has two types of inducements: those prohibited by law, which would be like bribes, those which I think you know, are a lot more black, for want of a better word, something that's clear, that's against the law, versus those areas where there's general guidance, there's principles that needs to be applied, but there's no black or white. This is one of those areas where you need to apply your mind. You know, it's interesting. I'm not sure if any of you have followed what's happened with the collapse of Enron, but one of the financial controller, or I can't remember what the American term was, Andy Fastow, was very much involved and served time in jail for his involvement in the collapse there. And it was interesting. I was watching a video of his where he's a motivational speaker now, and sort of speaking to people about ethics and these gray areas. And, you know, he was saying that this, you know, the transactions that were put together, the way in which Enron was conducting itself, was signed off by boards of directors, was signed off, agreements were signed by attorneys, signed off by internal audit, signed off by external audit. And then he says he's not underplaying the role that he played in it, but that's how sometimes gray these areas are. and we need to just be alert to that and make sure that we don't fall on the wrong side, not only of the law, but of the moral compass on the ethical standards to which we should be living. So when we look at the code, and we need to understand which parts of the code apply to which type of professional accountants. So no matter what services you offer, part 1 is applicable. Part 1 deals with the fundamental principles and the conceptual framework, which we'll be discussing towards the end of today's session, which looks at the way in which a professional accountant must apply their mind when dealing with ethical challenges. And we then have parts 2, 3, and 4, and parts 2, 3, and 4 are not applicable to all professional accountants, and this depends on the types of services that you offer. That would then determine which part of the code you apply. So if you are a registered auditor, or you perform independent review engagements for entities which have a public interest score between 100 and 350 points in terms of the Companies Act Regulation 26, I think it is, then you would fall part of part 3. And that's where most of your guidance will be to sort of prohibited services. And how do you then apply the principles, and what specific rules there are that you need to comply with. If you're a business rescue practitioner, forensics consulting, doing accounting work, tax work, you're not in an audit firm, well, then you would be considered to be a professional accountant, professional accounts in business. And there, less onerous requirements, because there's less reliance on your work, but there is still expectation and needs to be proper moral behavior that needs to be standardized, and therefore part 2 deals with professional activities, whether as a contractor, employee, or owner, in terms of the professional services and how one needs to interact with their business, personal relationships, and functions both within and outside of the firm. The independent standards, part 4, they set out the additional guidance for those of you that are doing assurance work, which means audits, reviews, or related assurance. So this would not include compilations, would not include agreed upon procedures engagements. Some courses we've run that part of Dan and Stan's program. We ran courses earlier this year on those. And why this is critical to understand is, depending on your level of services that you offer, you may fall into one or all of these. So, for example, the IRBA have adopted parts 1, 3, and 4 as part of their code, because they don't deal with professional accountants in business. SICA have adopted parts 1, 2, and 4, and say that if you're an auditor, you need to look at the IRBA Code of Conduct. And then SIPA would also speak to parts 1 and 2. Sorry, SIPA wouldn't necessarily need to look at part 4 either, and nor would SIPA, because these are when you're doing assurance engagements, audits, reviews. Is that clear? I don't know if there's any questions on any of that. And then we'll start going through some of these aspects, part 1 in particular, where we'll spend most of our time. We'll touch briefly on part 4, and then just some aspects of the other areas. Okay, great. Can't see any questions coming through. So then let's look now at how the code is structured. And for those of you that are SIPA or SICA members, this applies equally to you. The requirements of the code, or let me rather just say that the code is structured in such a way that specific topics are addressed, and then there are subsections which clarify how one needs to go about applying and acting ethically. There's an introduction which deals with giving an overview of which matters will be addressed in the various sections. So, for example, section 100 deals with the fundamental principles. Sections and other sections will then appropriately deal with, like section 500 is part of the independent standards that deals with the requirements over there. And then what we do is the code is then structured in such a way that there are requirements, and those requirements are introduced with a R prior to the section number or paragraph number. So, for example, R115 deals with the requirements every professional accountant has in terms of, because it's a 100 series, in terms of the fundamental principle. And if my mind serves me correctly, that would deal with something along the lines of due professional care, or something similar to one of those fundamental principles there. But we'll be touching on that in due course. The sections then also have specific obligations, which are introduced with an R as well. And then there is what they call application guidance. And that application guidance looks at providing more context, giving an explanation of the requirement, recommending actions or suggestions as to how to comply, sometimes with illustrations and other guidance, so that a practitioner is then able to execute their responsibilities. So, as I mentioned, the code has been around now, some of the sections since 2018, some sections actually as recently as 2021 have been amended, with an effective date still for 2022. So I'm not going to be touching on that too much. But I found a video clip just that speaks about the changes, which we'll be showing just now. But to understand then from the effective date, so the magic number is the 15th of June, parts 1 and 3. So for those of you, that's the fundamental principles. And just going to go back there so you can see that, part 3 being for registered auditors. That being effective since 15th of June 2019. Parts 4A and Parts 4B. Those are the independent standards. Previously, the independent standards were part of the code in sections 290 and 291. That was found to be confusing because, as we said, it's only applicable for audits and reviews or assurance engagements. It doesn't apply to business rescue practitioners, forensics accountants, those performing tax services. If, however, you're part of an audit firm, well, then it would scope you in terms of 4A and B because the firm would need to comply with that. But if you just do accounting and tax services or consulting, then you wouldn't be required to comply with parts 4A and B. And that's why we're only going to briefly touch, based on this audience, on those requirements. And then there's the long association provisions, which deal with the rotation requirements from an ethical perspective, which, based on this audience, also not going to be touching on, deals mainly with public interest entities. If you've got a public interest entity, which we'll have a look at what that definition is a bit later, how often does the partner need to rotate? How often does other senior employees like external quality control reviewers need to get involved? And then what's those cooling off periods? How long before they can then resume being involved on those activities? So let's then have a look at a quick video clip. As I said, we did test the sound earlier, so I can't hear it, but it was coming through on the Zoom. So let's hope that it comes through now, and please let me know if there's a problem. We'll try once or twice to get it right, but hopefully it's going to work first. Right, so this is just something of why they've changed, just for you to understand the concerns and problems that were being experienced in the industry.
The restructuring was undertaken in response to input from a broad range of stakeholders who encouraged IESBA to improve the understandability and usability of the code. Some, particularly infrequent users of the code, saw this as a way to facilitate compliance. Others, particularly regulators, saw this as a way to facilitate enforcement. There was widespread agreement that an appropriately restructured code would help professional accountants act ethically and, when appropriate, maintain their independence. Does the restructured code live up to its promise? I believe it does. Feedback from stakeholders over the course of the project has consistently been very positive regarding the changes being made and the improvements achieved. Key features of the code: first of all, the code remains principles-based. The overarching requirements to comply with the fundamental principles, be independent when appropriate, and apply the conceptual framework to identify, evaluate, and address threats feature prominently. Second, specific requirements, which help make the application of the conceptual framework more robust, are clearly distinguished from application material, and application material is clearly linked to related requirements. Third, responsibility is more clearly communicated, avoiding passive language. And for those dealing with independence, responsibility is linked to the requirements of ISQC 1, IAASB's quality control standard. Fourth, sections are more self-contained to help readers understand topics more completely, and at the same time, readers are directed to other relevant areas in the code that set out the overarching requirements and other material of a more general nature. And finally, language has been clarified and material is more readable. The restructured code also includes new and more robust material that increases the overall usefulness of it. The conceptual framework is now more robust, and new or revised material has been included for dealing with non-compliance with laws and regulations, long association, and topics for professional accountants in business, which in some cases are applicable to professional accountants in public practice. Revised material dealing with inducements is currently being finalized. And the code is also accompanied by a guide designed to assist new and infrequent users to better understand what the code contains and how to use it. With the restructuring complete, IASBA is working on making the code available electronically in a way that is user-friendly, making it easier to learn what the code is all about and to deal with ethics and independence questions that arise. The plan is to have these enhanced features available in 2019 when the restructured code becomes effective, to facilitate its adoption and implementation.
Right, so, I think that's a very nice overview. Like I said, it is an old video, but the information is as relevant as it was then. Obviously, things such as that, what they're referring to is June 2019, doing an online, an e-version of the code. That has been done and is available. Interesting, if any of you are wanting copies of the code, not from SAIC or from your institute, it's free to join the IFAC website. You just need to register and download the information firsthand. So I strongly recommend that. Just on the independence standards, so as we said, parts 4A and 4B have been pointed out previously, sections 290 and 291. Now, separate independence standards being 4A and B. And I want to just stress the importance here of even to non-auditors. And that is because we need to realize that when it comes to even a compilation engagement, even though if you prepare a set of financial statements for somebody or you're involved as a business rescue practitioner, these standards are not mandatory and do not apply. There is an expectation from the market, from the public, that if you're a professional accountant, you are then responsible and have a level of ethical standards which you comply with. And therefore, one just needs to make sure, and often it's useful, if you're not sure if you're on the right side of the independence line, then one needs to consult, one needs to engage with fellow practitioners, experts, just to make sure that one's not infringing on the standards. So very briefly, as I've said, this applies to auditors and those doing independent reviews. This is the ethical requirements. And we'll touch on, if you'd like, the requirements from an aspect of the Companies Act perspective, just to make sure that we've got that clear. But one needs to make sure that there are two aspects of independence, and one needs to understand that independence of mind and independence of appearance are two different aspects that work together when evaluating whether or not a person is complying with the necessary requirements of the code. And if we look at them then individually, Independence of mind is the ability to act in a way to carry out one's duties without being affected by influences that compromise your professional judgment. And independence is directly linked to the fundamental principles of integrity, objectivity, and professional skepticism, which is the new requirement and what has achieved a lot more focus. When it comes to independence in appearance, this is that level of independence whereby somebody else looking in would say, yes, I agree, John, Joan, Sam have acted in a way that I, looking at from the outside, would conclude that the person's integrity, objectivity, or professional skepticism has not been compromised. And we need to make sure that and understand that it's in this regard that we focus on the way in which we engage, because as professional accountants, there's a level of professionalism that is required, and linked to that professionalism is the aspect of independence. And as I've said, that's mandatory for audits or reviews. Just before we break, from a legal perspective, from the Companies Act perspective, when it comes to rotation, there are additional requirements. For example, the Companies Act says that an auditor is not allowed to be the audit partner for an audit for an entity which they have been involved in the preparation of the financial statements. That's a legal requirement, not in the code. And we'll have a look just now when it comes to sort of management responsibility. That takes on all, that affects independence in all types of services, because where one is taking on management decisions, then there's a risk that one's independence will be impaired. And it's like sort of doing work and then saying you're checking it, or it just raises too many risks. So that brings us to an appropriate time to break for literally a 10-minute break. So please, if you can, please make sure that you're back after 10 minutes. We will be starting sharp. So please just synchronize your watches, quick leg stretch, grab a cup of coffee, bathroom break, whatever you need, and then we'll be back just now. Okay, super. See you just now. I'm going to switch off my video and we'll be back just now. Right, if you can settle down, we'll be starting shortly. Right, welcome back. Can I just have from a show of hands, just who's here? Just if you're back, so I can continue, just raise your hand. Just keep your hands up so I can just make sure that most people are back. Keep your hands up, thank you. Okay, so we've got more than half of you raising your hand, so thanks very much. Okay, and one person responding in the chat, thank you. Okay, great, you can lower your hands, thanks. So let's move on then and have a look then at, when it comes to a professional accountant, how does one need to behave? How does one need to interact? And how does professional skepticism inculcate in professional judgment, in terms of ethical decision making, and the way in which we need to behave? And the first aspect is to realize that professional skepticism is an attitude that's applied when making professional judgments. And we then need to focus on how do we apply that in making ethical decisions. And when it comes to these aspects, we need to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what action we then need to take, or what actions are available for us to take, and then the documentation of professional judgment and how we then go about recording that, and when there's a requirement that we need to document. So let's then have a look at the attitude and understand then a bit more what is professional skepticism. So some people believe that professional skepticism is questioning everything. And I think if we take a moment to think about that, if you deliberate on that, you'll realize, well, that's not skepticism, that's paranoia. And therefore, what is professional skepticism? So it's an attitude of a questioning mind, being alert for conditions or circumstances which may indicate that something may be misstated. And therefore, I want you to take a moment and think of, in your services that you offer, be that tax, consulting, audits, whatever service you're involved in, where should you be applying professional skepticism? So if you're involved in audit, so the ICEs say, if you're doing audits where there's a possibility of management bias, accounting estimates, significant judgments, those are areas that auditors need to apply professional skepticism. But we need to realize that when it comes to other professionals, they equally have a responsibility to apply professional skepticism whenever you exercise your professional judgment. If you're faced with a decision that needs to be taken, you're a valuation expert. Well, what methodology should be utilized? Well, that's applying professional judgment. And therefore, another example, you're compiling a set of financial statements. Information is given to you. You need to evaluate that information to see, well, is there anything that's potentially missing? Is there anything that's contradictory? Is there anything that, based on your knowledge of the industry, of the company, or the directors, that's not making sense? If you're doing a service of forensic, well, there, your professional skepticism needs to be enhanced, because there, often you're coming in either to prove and quantify the extent of a fraud, or to determine whether or not a fraud has actually taken place. And it could be the very people that are giving you that information that may have committed the fraud. So professional skepticism is critical in any engagement, any service that you offer, and it is interconnected with the fundamental principles that form the basis for the code of professional conduct, for the ethical code. And hopefully these are familiar to you: integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior. So let's now have a look at those in a bit more detail and understand how professional skepticism needs to be applied in these areas. So when it comes to integrity, one needs to be straightforward and honest in all one's dealings with a client. And we need to exercise this principle where we engage with clients. We need to make sure that we raise concerns if a client is taking a position which is unethical, which is not honest, not the correct way of doing business. And we need to continually challenge management or the client or their staff about information which is inconsistent with information that's either gathered as part of an audit or information you're doing a compilation. You have a look, the level of legal fees doesn't make sense in terms of the type of business that they do, or the payroll costs compared to the the PAYE recon doesn't make sense. There's huge differences. Depreciation. The numbers aren't correlating with what would be expected of the level of assets that they've got. And no matter what service we provide, we need to realize that we have a sense of responsibility to critically examine that information to determine whether or not it may not be giving the true and fair picture. Remember, when it comes to integrity, integrity is giving the full picture. So if somebody's leaving something out, that's also a challenge on integrity, particularly if they're trying to do that in such a way that it misdirects the understanding of actually what's transpired, be that in a set of financial statements, in a business rescue plan, in a forensic report, no matter what service you're offering. Objectivity. Objectivity is impaired whereby a professional, because of bias, conflict, or an inducement, could lead one to a situation whereby the interests of certain parties or users of whatever service one's involved in are being favored to the detriment of others. You know, an interesting example, business rescue practitioners need to make sure that they balance the needs and rights of all different parties. And one needs to make sure that no matter what role you're involved in, that we look at the circumstances, we look at the relationships, the threat of familiarity with a client that could compromise one's objectivity. When it comes to competence and due care, no matter what service you're offering, you need to make sure that you have the necessary knowledge and that you're able to apply that knowledge to the circumstances for which you've been engaged. Part of applying that knowledge is identifying areas where the information is lacking, the information isn't making sense, additional information may be required. That could be applicable in terms of your knowledge of your client's industry, could be dealing with making sure that you're up to date with the latest guidance that has been issued for the services that you're offering, be that from the company's commission, business rescue guidance, business rescue practitioners, any changes around legislation, qualifications, CPD requirements, and then taking that knowledge and then applying that to make sure that you then carry out your responsibilities to make sure that you are alert and are able to pick up if there's any information that may not make sense, may be contradictory. And in an audit environment, that would allow you to identify risks. In a compilation, that would allow you to look for information that doesn't make sense to request further information, to ask the client the correct questions, to make sure that the information is presenting a true and fair picture of how the entity has performed. And then taking the necessary course of action by audit would be to design procedures. In terms of a compilation, would be to engage with the client to get the answers that you require. Review maybe further inquiry or analytical procedures to understand whether or not any risks that you're concerned about have been mitigated. With regards to the responsibility of confidentiality, so confidentiality is that responsibility whereby a professional accountant ensures that information stays within the limits to whom it's been disclosed, and that could be applying to a firm, could be applying at an employee, and that one does not use that information to any personal advantage. One also needs to be alert for the possibility of inadvertent disclosure in terms of a social environment. One needs to make sure that information is protected between family members or business associates. Needs to protect the client relationship as well as prospective clients. And then we need to understand that the level and principle of confidentiality extends even when the relationship is ended. In other words, after the end of an audit or a forensic investigation, there's a level of responsibility that needs to be maintained. And even when changing employment, certain tools would need to be protected, and one can't utilize that at a different firm, for example. There are confidentiality overriding criteria or principles, and that applies where, for example, there is a public interest cause, and therefore knowledge of this information may be pertinent and required to be shared. Maybe, for example, where certain information is required in legal proceedings, or there's a specific law, for example, FICA, that would require a person to make a report to the Financial Intelligence Center. In terms of regulatory bodies, to the RBA or to SICA or CIPA in terms of investigations that they may wish to conduct. And then there's also the override in terms of non-compliance with laws and regulations, NOCLAW, whereby an auditor is required to sort of disclose certain information. And in terms, for those of you that are also auditors, for reportable irregularities. And the other one that comes to mind is just to clarify, you've got material irregularities in terms of the Companies Act. If you're doing an independent review, you may have a responsibility to report a material irregularity. And from a NOCLAW, remember that's your if you're an auditor, you need to consider no-CLAR as well as no reportable irregularities. If you're an independent reviewer, you need to consider no-CLAR as well as the Companies Act requirements if you're doing a review. But at the same time, there's also a level from a perspective of making sure that one's behaving ethically. And while professional accountants are considered the financial police watchdogs, one needs to balance that. And there may be times where one's asked to do something, but one may need to seek legal advice to determine whether or not you're actually allowed to disclose such information. And when it comes to professional behavior, a professional accountant is required to make sure that they take every necessary step to ensure that the auditor or professional accountant, in whatever role they play, does not bring the profession into disrepute, and any activities, one needs to make sure that one is acting in the best interests of the profession, and that one's behavior is not undermining any of the these fundamental principles that we've just been discussing: integrity, confidentiality, due professional care, etc. So we've been speaking about how professional skepticism integrates and plays out in terms of the fundamental principles. Let's then understand that when it comes to applying professional skepticism, in summary, that's an evaluation of information to critically assess whether or not it supports a conclusion. And we need to make sure that we're not trying to justify a preconceived idea. You know, it's interesting. I've heard it expressed by some regulators around the world. You know, and I suppose I'm thinking of another example. You know, one can't assume when preparing financial statements that they are correct. One needs to understand and question that and be alert for possible errors, be they intentional or not. In an audit environment, you know, or even in a consulting environment, you know, one needs to try and understand, what is the client trying to do? Is there a picture that's trying to be painted, be that from a compilation, from an audit, from a business rescue perspective, that is preconceived, that the picture is trying to be painted in a particular way, and therefore one may need to do particular work to determine whether or not, well, that is the true picture. One needs to make sure that when one's applying professional skepticism, one evaluates information, one looks for evidence to verify concerns or possible errors, or just the amounts, and then one's in a position to objectively conclude, based on the process that has been followed, whether or not anything is missing, anything needs to be changed. Whereas a cynic is somebody that's inflexible, that accepts information with no level of trust at all, and therefore questions and challenges everybody. You know, I remember when I was a first-year audit clerk, you know, it was like almost, well, you know, how can you believe a thing a client says? That needs to be evaluated and tempered with a level of professional skepticism, whereby you trust information, but you check it and question its authenticity to determine whether or not there is any misstatements. One needs to be alert in whatever role you're servicing your clients that education has a significant impact and can inhibit the ability to apply your mind appropriately, and the lack of education or being up to date with the roles in which you service your client can also have a significant impact on your ability to exercise proper professional skepticism. So, examples of being a skeptic is look at contradictory viewpoints. Strong ideas emanate from looking at aspects from both standpoints. Play devil's advocate. What if assumptions were reversed? They're saying they're going to taxes is payable at this rate, the amounts sitting in the accounts are not correct. Ask them of adjustments that should have gone through, but ask them of adjustments, too many adjustments that have gone through. And so professional skepticism needs to be applied in making decisions. And we've had a look at how the attitude of professional skepticism needs to be applied. We're now going to look at how does one go about applying professional skepticism in making professional judgments. And the concept of professional judgment will often facilitate the appropriate exercise of professional skepticism. And similarly, professional skepticism requires professional judgment to be applied. And both concepts are essential in decision-making to ensure that there is proper compliance with your professional and ethical responsibilities. When one gets information, one needs to look at what information is one after. Is this information coming from the appropriate source? The people that have provided that information, are they the appropriate people? Do they have any, or could they have any agendas, hidden agendas? When was this information received? Is the explanations that one's receiving appropriate? Does it make sense? And are there any other circumstances, any other considerations that should be given to the information that we're utilizing? One of the significant impediments to professional judgment is when one is taking on different roles, and particularly the role that your client should be accepting. And depending on the nature of service that you play, well, one needs to be very careful how then one goes about in exercising one's responsibilities. Because when one assumes management responsibility, that could significantly impair one's independence or objectivity. And therefore, one needs to be alert to or if you're involved in controlling anything in terms of potentially leading discussions, setting agendas, directing an entity, that could lead to an impairment of independence. And that would be around the acquisition or deployment or control of human capital, financial capital, technological or technical resources, any physical assets, or any intangible resources. So let's have a look at practically then examples of what is considered to be assuming management responsibility. Setting policies and strategic direction. Are you involved in determining the mission of your clients? In the accounting world, do you authorize the transactions or do you process them? Having discussions with those charged with governance, being involved in hiring or firing of employees, directing or taking responsibility for actions of employees, implementation of changes or recommendations, design and monitoring of internal controls, preparation of financial statements. These are roles and responsibilities of management. Okay, if you engage as a compiler, that's not taking on management responsibility, but you need to make sure that management then give you the information, that management are involved in calculating the information, that management make the decisions as to what framework they're on, because otherwise you're then taking on too much responsibility and run the risk of your professional skepticism being impaired and the inability to objectively exercise your professional judgment. So I just want to show another short video clip just on the next aspect of the code, and then I think we'll probably then break after this video for we can do 20 minutes if that'll be okay, and then we'll do the rest of the slides. So let's have a look now. You can just listen to this video on the stages of the conceptual framework. In other words, what this is going to focus on is how do we then take what's in the code and come up with a basis upon which we're going to be able to evaluate and apply our minds to different ethical scenarios.
Similar to the current code, the new International Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants sets out the fundamental principles of ethics that establish the standard of behavior that is required and expected of all professional accountants. Those fundamental principles reflect the profession's recognition of its public interest responsibility. The new code features an enhanced conceptual framework, which is a logical, principles-based approach that all professional accountants are required to apply when dealing with ethics and independence issues. The conceptual framework is a separate section in the code with explicit provisions to describe a simple three-stage process for thinking about whether or not a situation creates a threat to compliance with the fundamental principles, and if so, whether such a threat is at an acceptable level and what should be done as a result. The stages of the conceptual framework involves identifying, evaluating, and addressing the threats. The conceptual framework also applies equally to independence. The categories of threats are unchanged. However, the application of the enhanced conceptual framework will require a mind shift from the former threats and safeguards approach particularly in terms of how threats are evaluated and addressed. The new code dispels the myth that applying safeguards is the only way to address a threat. It clarifies that threats are addressed either by eliminating the circumstances, interest, or relationship creating the threat, applying safeguards where available and capable of being applied, and declining or ending the specific professional activity or service. In order for an action to be a safeguard, it has to be effective in reducing the threat to an acceptable level. Critical to the determination of whether a threat is at an acceptable level is the process of the reasonable and informed third-party test. The concept of a reasonable and informed third-party test involves a consideration of the perspective of a reasonable and informed third party and whether that third party would likely reach the same conclusion or judgment as the professional accountant. The enhanced conceptual framework also emphasizes the importance of exercising professional judgment in understanding the facts and circumstances, including the nature of the professional service, relationship, or financial interests. Although professional accountants are not expected to undertake extensive searches for new information or changes in facts and circumstances, they are expected to remain alert for them and reevaluate and address any new threats that are identified as a result. The new code requires professional accountants to perform an overall assessment, which is essentially stepping back to think about and determine whether the actions that were taken to address the threats identified were appropriate and effective, having regard, of course, to the reasonable and informed third-party test.
Right. So before we go on, just a question. Do you have any questions before we continue? On the video, we're going to be discussing how the stages of the conceptual framework fit together, or on anything else we've discussed so far. Okay, I can't see any questions. So then I think let's take a 20-minute break now. So if we can just synchronize watches, I make it 10:02, so we'll be back at 10 past. Enjoy your break and see you just now. Right, welcome back. If you can just settle down of today, and I believe the final session for CPT courses for this year. So let's have a look now at the stages of the conceptual framework. And as was discussed in the video, we need to look at identifying the threats, evaluating those threats, and then having an appropriate response to address those threats. And working in the background, we've got exercising professional judgment, we've got being alert for information that changes the facts and circumstances, and then the reasonable and informed third-party test. So let's take these concepts and understand then how do we then apply it to evaluating ethical dilemmas. To clarify, when we speak about the identifying the threat, we're looking at, well, yes, understanding the information, but what's critical is which of the fundamental principles are being threatened. We then need to also look at evaluating that threat, how it's being identified, including a understanding of the whether or not the actual fundamental principle is correct, as well as then addressing the threat, which includes that new requirement, as was mentioned in that video clip before we took our break, of the reasonable and informed third party, as well as a step back approach whereby one lets information filter, one looks at making sure that we consider the information and then evaluates that to determine whether or not one's actually arrived at the correct conclusion. Right. So, in terms of looking at the overarching requirement of professional judgment, as we've said, there is a level of expectation whereby a person remains alert for information and circumstances and changes in those facts and circumstances, because that could affect the nature of the service which one is offering. And then one needs to exercise professional judgment and then look at things objectively from a reasonable and informed third party to determine whether or not the information is correct, whether or not the way in which one's looking to address it is appropriate, and whether or not the conclusion reached and the threat has been reduced to an acceptable level. So in the application material, the application of professional skepticism and professional judgment is emphasized, and one needs to make sure that one places a significant focus of one's work on understanding the information, the facts and circumstances, so one is then able to apply one's mind appropriately. Professional judgment is then the application of the relevant knowledge and skills that a person has gained from experience, as well as keeping up to date, that would include the nature and scope of the particular circumstances and facts, to make sure that one has a detailed understanding in order to provide the service, and then making a concerted effort to then define what needs to be done, the work, the particular professional activities, and any interests and any relationships involved, those parties that are going to be party to the receipt of the professional services. So the approach then to professional judgment is making sure that one has a sufficient understanding of the facts, a detailed understanding of the circumstances, and one needs to make sure that one focuses on any independence, any professional skepticism, any challenges, any threats to the fundamental principles. So how then do we go about obtaining an understanding of those facts and circumstances? We need to be alert for the possibility that information may not be complete, looking at contradictions, inconsistencies between known facts and expectations, the reason behind why information may not be accurate, taking the knowledge and skills that one's gained, realizing that there may be circumstances that one needs to consult further, be that experts or additional staff or colleagues, just to get a deeper understanding. That understanding needs to be sufficient so that there's a reasonable basis to express an opinion or produce the output of whatever services you've been asked, and then an understanding of other possible courses of action which could be relevant to the circumstances, so that one makes sure that one has looked at those alternatives and there is a clear understanding of why these other alternatives have been refuted, discontinued, to arrive at the ultimate conclusion that one did. And remember, this is to understand how one is exercising and examining circumstances to determine whether or not there is any threats, what has one done about those threats, and what is the overall conclusion. Once one's carried that out, once one's identified the threat, one's carried that out, there's a need to take a stand-back approach and utilize what is called the reasonable and informed third-party test. And what is the reasonable and informed third party? So that is somebody that has the same level of knowledge that one would be expected to have, meaning all facts are known, or one is aware of anything that one should be reasonably expect to know. And this information would need to be available at the time when the decision was being made. There's an expected level of knowledge and experience, and that information needs to be applied in an impartial manner with the ultimate objective that the same conclusion based on the facts and circumstances, the timing of when the decision was made, the knowledge and experience, and being objective, the same conclusion can then be reached by another party. And that's what's called the reasonable and informed third party test. So sounds very well good in theory. How then do we apply that in practice? So some of the thoughts are, well, if it's around the area of applying the conceptual framework, understanding whether or not there is appropriate consideration. I'll get to the question shortly. Is there appropriate consideration of the relevant fundamental principles? Has one gained a deep enough understanding of the facts and circumstances? When it comes to looking at the reasonable and informed third party test to address a threat, well, has that threat been reduced to an acceptable level? And an acceptable level means that the threat is no longer present, or the risk that the threat brought about has been eliminated or reduced. And then, if you're looking at it, for example, from an independence perspective, the reasonable and informed third party test would be to say, well, what would somebody outside looking in say whether or not somebody is independent from an appearance perspective? What would they consider? So there's been a question posed. The moral compass in South Africa is broken and sound judgment adversely influenced. So, yeah, I hear your comment, and I think we all agree with your comment. But at the same time, you know, we can't hide our head in the sand and say, well, you know, things are rotten at the core, you know, let's not do anything about it. Otherwise, things would just get worse. You know, I remember attending a talk by Edwin some 2 years ago. Yeah, around about 2 years ago, just before the onset of COVID. And, you know, he said a very interesting comment. He said that there was a group of concerned businessmen when there was the change in ministers of finance, and a certain individual was appointed, which we know was a possible yes man to the then president. And, you know, he said that a lot of people said, what must we get involved for? Let's just leave it, you know, And some concerned people said, no, this is enough. And they actually had meetings and rallied together and had wrote articles and press conferences, and these group of very influential businessmen actually sat around getting that decision reversed. And, you know, those are people that had significant influence and could do that. But I think we need to also not undermine and underplay the importance that an individual can have. Because if the 67 people on this, in this session, can influence 1 or 2 people, well, there's an exponential improvement and reverse of what's actually happening. And I think, you know, we need to understand that we have a sense of responsibility and make sure that we live up to that ethical responsibility. I hope that's answered your question. I've addressed your comment satisfactorily. Right. So we've been speaking about identification of threats. Let's have a look at how does one go about addressing the threat. And there we look at the actions that professional judgment needs to take to determine how one deals with an ethical challenge. And in that regard, we need to realize that the professional judgments that the auditor takes determines the basis for any professional accountant, not just an auditor, I should be saying, forms the basis for which people will evaluate and determine whether or not appropriate action has been taken. So how does the code go about then addressing a threat to objectivity, independence, integrity, etc.? So we need to realize that there are 3 possible choices for addressing a threat. The first is to eliminate the circumstances. So, for example, there could be a threat to objectivity. You may know, or maybe doing work for a family member, and well, you can then, that's probably more on the declining or ending. You know, if you can't do that work, well, then you would need to stop that relationship totally. There may be situations whereby one can eliminate the circumstances. For example, you have the you prepare the financial statements for an entity, therefore you can't audit them or review because you're a one-man practice in a review engagement, and therefore, well, there you could take on that work for somebody else, for their clients, and have a reciprocal relationship whereby you do the drafting for one of your colleagues in the industry and vice versa. The middle category is that of applying safeguards, and as was said in the first video, that this is an area that has received significant improvements and refinement, because we need to realize that not every threat can be addressed with a safeguard, because some threats are too serious and therefore a safeguard is not applicable. So the safeguards have been clarified to understand when they are appropriate, and where they're not appropriate, then those relationships would need to be eliminated or, as we mentioned, declined, or those relationships or services ended. The code has clarified and correlated when specific safeguards are allowed and in response to which threats, and therefore not every threat can be addressed by a safeguard. So it's important that we then understand what is a safeguard, and a safeguard is defined as an action or actions which individually or in combination with other actions that a professional accountant can take will reduce the threat of compliance with a fundamental principle to an acceptable level. The next question is, what is an acceptable level? And there we need to look at applying the reasonable and informed third-party test, and where another individual would conclude that the action taken is appropriate and that there's no longer a threat, and that the professional accountant's actions are appropriate, and that there has been compliance with the fundamental principles, confidentiality, due professional care, integrity, etc. And obviously, the appropriateness of an action and its effectiveness is the result of professional judgment. And that's why it's important that one looks and applies what we've been discussing around professional judgment to make sure that one is not compromising any of the fundamental principles. There's also an overall new requirement that where one is exercising significant judgment, that to make sure that one is acting appropriately, this could be in an area which, for example, maybe an ethical concern around sort of taking on certain types of work, these sort of areas, that consideration of significant judgments and overall conclusions reached need to have the reasonable and informed third-party test carried out, because there needs to be an independent, or not independent, a objective, cold, calculated assessment of any significant judgments because of the impact that this could have and the self-interest that is involved in such decisions. This involves areas of, the types of services, for example, you can offer. Is that the correct ethical decision that you've taken to give this service? Or is this a gray area which you may be stepping on the wrong side of the ethical code? Or advice that you're giving to a consulting client, is there a level of self-interest that's found its way into the actual decision? Right. That then deals with the way in which we look at the attitude, the application of professional judgment or professional skepticism in professional judgment, and the way in which we take prompt action to address any of these threats. The final aspect from the code's perspective around the framework of dealing with ethical conflicts is the documentation of professional judgments. And while there's a level of intelligence and free choice that needs to be given to professionals in terms of applying policies and principles, we need to realize that we also need to document and put down on paper how professional judgments have been applied, the entire framework, the identification of the facts and circumstances, the fundamental principles that were being challenged in the ethical dilemma that one was facing, how one evaluated alternatives, consultations that may have taken place, and then the actions that the professional accountant undertook and the conclusions that then were reached. And it's this documentation at the time that becomes critical, because having a look at it at a later stage, often it's then too late, because then one doesn't remember the exact way in which the events took place, as well as the way in which it would need to be applied, and any other considerations or concerns. So, in terms of public interest entities, so we mentioned that the code applies independent standards, for example, apply to public interest entities, and the rotation requirements apply to public interest entities. And we need to then make sure that we then comply with these requirements. And there's a South African requirement in the code introduced by the RBA. So for those of you that are auditors, please pay specific attention. Then we've got one more slide which will take us for the last 20 minutes of today's session. So, so a firm is required to determine which entities it needs to consider as public interest, and the consideration needs to be made based on the nature of the type of business that that entity is. For example, if it holds fiduciary assets for a large number of stakeholders, number of equity or debt holders, the size of the entity, or the number of employees. For those of you that are familiar with the requirements of the Public Interest Score and the Companies Act and the regulations, most of these are, the only ones that's not here is, no, they're all here, no, number of employees is yes, is size. Size is a different one, but the rest are all here. And then the RBA has issued a list of public interest entities which they believe because of, for example, their assets that they hold. For example, I think it speaks about 10 billion rands worth of assets under management in sort of pension funds and those sort of aspects. So it gives you a level of understanding what a public interest entity is in terms of the IRBA Code. Don't know if there's any questions on any of that before we look at how then we go about applying the framework, the conceptual framework, to address ethical challenges. Okay, so can't see any questions. So let's then have a look. You know, this is a very interesting and useful tool that one can utilize to see how one dealing with ethical challenges and to make sure that one's looking at it holistically. So the first aspect would be to define the problem, to understand what's going on, who the players are, who's going to be affected by the decision that one's going to be taking. Is this an area in which one's got all the facts and circumstances? Are there other parties from which further information must be gathered to understand those facts and circumstances? And, you know, when one's then evaluating this, this model looks at what they call these plus filters, which says, well, when we're defining the problem, what other aspects can we look at? What other considerations need to be borne in mind? And that could be, for example, why is the decision actually being called? You know, is there adequate understanding of the rationale, the business rationale for what's being taken, the decision that's being faced? Who are the stakeholders? Who's involved? Who's going to be affected by that decision? And what is the ultimately desired outcome of the decision, of the problem, of the service that one's looking to undertake? And has one ultimately addressed and identified which of the fundamental principles is truly in question? Imperative when one deals with ethical challenges, that one has a sounding board, one seeks the assistance of other parties, looks at doing further research, looking at guidance from practitioners or colleagues or consultants, and then making sure that if there is any guidance in the professional standards, that that has been appropriately considered. Does the organization or entity have any specific policies around the code for ethics? And then looking for the advice of mentors, colleagues, or specialists in particular areas. One then needs to take the scenario and identify all the available alternatives that could resolve the problem. That looks at what are the non-negotiables, what can or cannot be done, looking at aspects of, well, different scenarios, different possibilities that one could introduce as a possible solution, different methods, different resources, and once that's been identified, well, then one can move on to the next step, which is to evaluate the different solutions to determine, well, which ones are viable, which ones are not, which ones will achieve the desired result. The desired result being that the fundamental principle is no longer in threat. There's no longer concern that that may not be complied with. And, you know, there's different ways of sort of doing this. One can look at sort of pros and cons of each alternative. For example, you know, one's looking at doing a compilation engagement, and there may be a level of management responsibility that has been assumed. So, well, there could be a level of objectivity that could be impaired, and one could look at you know, possibly getting somebody else in, subcontracting, referring it out, those sort of scenarios. Once then one has evaluated the different possible courses of action, well, then what one needs to do is make a decision as to how the proposed response will address that threat, and then ensure that the risk of non-compliance with the fundamental principle, be it confidentiality, integrity, or whatever, is then mitigated adequately. One then would need to implement the decision. So take the action that has been determined to be the most suitable of the alternatives, and decide how that will need to be implemented to ensure that it then resolves the problem. And then ultimately, one needs to evaluate the decision, looking at the process that has been followed, making sure that there was no new information or information that one should have been aware of that comes to light. Ensure that one's looked at all the different alternatives, and that the decision that's been taken, excuse me, is in the best interest and in compliance with the fundamental principles of the code, and that then the decision taken has effectively reduced the threat to an acceptable level. Thereafter, it would be imperative to look at that reasonable and informed third-party test to make sure that somebody else objectively looking at the facts and circumstances with the knowledge and the required knowledge that all the alternative possibilities have been considered, and that one would then look at the different alternatives and weighing them up, determining which is the most appropriate. And somebody else would be able to reach a decision as that having reduced the threat to an acceptable level, whereby there's now no longer a threat to any of the fundamental principles. Right, that gives us just over 5 minutes to take any questions. Otherwise, while we're waiting for questions, just want to wish everybody a good holiday and stay safe and healthy with these COVID times. And thanks to Danny and Stan, and wish you all safe holidays. I'll stay online for some questions over to you, Stan or Danny.
Yeah, just if anyone wants to ask a question by speaking, they can just raise their hands in the thing, and I can allow them to talk if they need to, without typing out a question.
Edwin, it seems that there are no questions. You covered it a bit too thoroughly, perhaps. But I think everybody got the message. So I want to thank everybody, as you rightly said, for joining us. And the last of the seminars for 2021, we are planning a whole program of seminars for 2022. And wish everybody well over the festive season if they're going away. I hope that you go safely and return safely. And your certificates will be on the way in the next couple of days. So just expect those, look out for them. And again, thank you, Edwin, for good afternoon and very in-depth look at the ethical problems and the answers. And yeah, thank you, Danny.
Thanks again also from my side. And yeah, keep safe, keep well, everyone. Give it another 2 minutes, or I don't know, give it a minute. Just, I don't see anyone asking questions, but just giving a second. There's just one thank you. A lot of thank yous I'm seeing. But yes, thank you also to you guys for the support, and wish you all a festive season. Yes, I have sent, I'll resend out the notes to anyone who didn't get it. I see someone asking for notes, but it should have been sent to you, but I'll resend again another email to everyone again, just to make sure they got the notes. Otherwise, everyone keep well, keep safe, and see you next year.
Cheers.